Greetings, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program about the history of white feminism and the path to a future of change. My name is Marcia Eli. I'm the Director of Programs at the Center for Brooklyn History. Tonight is the second of two conversations presented in partnership with the Ms. Foundation for Women. This series is inspired by Koa Beck's book, White Feminism, From the Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind. In waiting behind this digital curtain are Koa and a truly amazing panel of speakers. Before I turn it over to them, I want to quickly share a little bit about CBH and the Ms. Foundation. The Center for Brooklyn History is a part of the Brooklyn Public Library and holds the most extensive collection of Brooklyn-related materials in the world. Every week, we offer free public programs through the library's programming arm, BPL Presents. Later this month, for instance, we are going to take a look at who gets to control our country's historical narrative. That struggle that is always in play, but more so recently, between initiatives like the 1619 Project and then patriotic history like the short-lived 1776 Commission. So these are the kinds of conversations that we stage, and BPL Presents also curates concerts and literary programs and much more. I really hope that you'll visit the Brooklyn Public Library's website, find BPL Presents, and explore what's coming up. It's an honor to be partners tonight with the Ms. Foundation for Women. Since 1973, it has championed women and girls investing over $72 million in more than 1,600 organizations fighting for gender and racial justice nationwide. The Ms. Foundation resources movements that center women and girls of color and creates opportunities for women and girls to seize justice and exercise their power so they are heard, valued, and respected socially and politically. We have a long and treasured history of partnering with the Ms. Foundation, and it is a great joy to join hands with them again tonight. Finally, I want to share that we have also joined hands with a local Brooklyn bookstore, the Community Bookstore, to offer a link to purchase Koa's book. We'll post that link in the chat a few times throughout the program, and thank you in advance for supporting Brooklyn's small businesses. And of course, I want to invite all of you to share your questions during the program. Please simply type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Koa Beck, who will in turn welcome everyone else. Former editor-in-chief of Jezebel, Koa was previously executive editor of Vogue.com and the senior features editor at marieclaire.com. In 2019, she was awarded the Joan Shorenstein Fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School to study the mechanics, history, and prevalence of white feminism. The resulting book was published last month by Atria. Thank you, Koa. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this conversation. I will now turn off my video and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for the incredible team at CBH and BPL, as well as the Ms. Foundation for Women for assembling all of this so that we can be together in this capacity. I am very excited to welcome our illustrious panelists. Rinku Sen is a writer and social justice strategist. She is formerly the executive director of Race Forward and was publisher of their award-winning news site, Colorlines. Under Sen's leadership, Race Forward generated some of the most impactful racial justice successes of recent years, including Drop the I Word, a campaign for media outlets to stop referring to immigrants as quote unquote illegal, resulting in the Associated Press, USA Today, LA Times, and many more outlets changing their practice. She was also the architect of the Shattered Families Report, which identified the number of kids in foster care whose parents had been deported. Her books, Stir It Up and The Accidental American, theorize a model of community organizing that integrates a political analysis of race, gender, class, poverty, sexuality, and other systems. She is currently the executive director of Narrative Initiative, which catalyzes durable narrative change in order to make equity and social justice common sense. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Teresa Younger is the president and CEO of the Ms. Foundation for Women. Prior to joining the Ms. Foundation for Women, she served as the executive director of the Connecticut General Assembly's Permanent Commission on the Status of Women, and as executive director of the ACLU of Connecticut, the first African American and the first woman to hold that position. Younger is a thought leader at the critical intersections of gender and race. Within the philanthropic sector, she serves on initiatives to shape and change the narrative of women and girls, including grant makers for girls of color, funders for reproductive equity, Philanthropy New York, and Black funders for social justice. She has appeared on or in MSNBC's Up with David Gura, NBC News, NPR Radio, Elle Magazine, Cosmopolitan, SiriusXM, and in USA Today, AP, Rewire, badasswomenleaders.com podcast, and the New York Times. Welcome so much, Teresa. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, Koa. Looking forward to this conversation.
And lastly, Andi Zeisler is the co-founder of Bitch Media, which for 25 years has published the award-winning magazine, Bitch, Feminist Response to Pop Culture. She is the author of the 2008 book, Feminism and Pop Culture, and the 2016 book, We Were Feminists Once, From Riot Girl to Cover Girl, The Buying and Selling of a Political Movement. She lives and writes in Portland, Oregon. Thank you for coming, Andi. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Sorry, I was muted.
It's okay. We're all winging it these days. I want to start very intentionally in the way that we started with part one of this talk, which if you have not seen it, I highly encourage you to watch it after this talk. It's called White Feminism and the Worker of Color. And a lot of what we're going to be discussing here today about structural solutions and initiatives, the foundation for a lot of that conversation exists in this previous discussion. So I highly recommend you see it. It's on YouTube as well as the CBH Facebook page. But I want to start with my own definition of white feminism. So everyone here, including the panelists as well as the audience, is aware of what I mean, at least when I use that term. I define white feminism in my book as a very specific approach and ideology towards achieving gender equality that pulls considerably from colonialism, imperialism, some key pieces of white supremacy, as well as labor exploitation, and very specifically often gauges the individual accumulation of wealth, power, autonomy as benchmarks of quote unquote feminism. So that's where we will be operating from. In terms of where I wanted to situate tonight's discussion, especially given what we discussed last week, I wanted to begin with a personal anecdote about quote unquote intersectionality that has come up for me a lot on book tour, and I'm sure all of the thinkers on tonight's panel have also been approached with this in some capacity. But something that has occurred, I mean, more times than I would prefer it to, in walking through, either feminist sanctioned spaces or feminist branded spaces, however you're interpreting that. An event, for instance, similar to this one, or a conference or any sort of like public speaking, the topics are set, the panelists are called, assembled, and then at the 11th hour, somebody turns around and says, oh, wait, is this intersectional? And I have several anecdotes essentially of that in my book that I explore, but I bring it up very intentionally with tonight's topics because to my assessment, especially in navigating the dynamics of white feminism, and then much of what facilitates white feminism in our country, including capitalism as well as many other dynamics. My sense is often that if you start at basic need, you don't necessarily then have to turn around, when you're 90% through with your editorial package, your meeting, your, speaking conference, your program, and then ask yourself if you, have in fact exercised intersectionality by effectively, having like one Black woman on your panel, or like one immigrant woman, or one trans person. If you start at things like affordable housing, food security, access to clean water, healthcare, things like that, by nature of how these entities have been taken from people, and also specifically taken from oppressed people, you will get to a quote unquote intersectional group of people by starting at basic need. So that's really what I want to start tonight, is specifically with basic need and many of those issues that I just cited. In my own book, I cite some data that is from 2018, and this is obviously pre-COVID, how 1 in 9 Americans lived in a food insecure household in that year. And more often than not, that was a household headed by a single woman. Sometimes she had children, sometimes she didn't. Contrastly, single-headed male households are less likely to be food insecure. There's a lot of different ways you can cut that data. I say, generally speaking, I think when I see data like this, is that poverty is a long-running symptom, an enduring symptom of patriarchy. And there's a lot of different ways into that data, whether you're talking about the wage gap or the lack of paid leave or domestic violence. There's a lot of factors by which single women are food insecure in this country, whether they have children or not. Keeping all of this in mind, what are some legislative efforts that could effectively help food insecure women in the United States? And I'm going to leave that to really whoever would like to start first. And again, there are so many ways into this issue, so I encourage you to really pull from wherever you feel most comfortable.
I'll jump in if that's okay, just because I want to take the easy answer, and I'll leave all the great brain trust power to Andi and Rinku, who I also am just honored to be on this panel with today. And congratulations, Koa, on your book. I've read it, and it really does give us another way and another perspective of thinking through what feminism could look like in this country if we actually addressed the reflections of where we're coming from and our own history as a country. So I just want to lift that up. I think, right off the bat, I would have to say basic minimum income is the easiest way to ensure that we have some levels of income security, which would then help with food insecurity. Because what happens in this country, as well as around the world, is that if we don't have money, we don't have money for food. And then I think we need to address issues around the profitization of food in this country, and where we have food deserts and where we don't, and what that needs to look like. But I do think that we could in this country actually live into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by ensuring that people could have those things. And that means they have food in their stomach, and they are not carrying heightened levels of stress, and they have access to healthcare and a roof over their head. And all of those things, I think, come by ensuring that people at least have, one, a livable wage, not minimum wage, but a livable wage and a minimum income, so that, and a realistic minimum income, so that they can actually pay for their food and for their livelihoods.
I can go next. And some of the thoughts I have about policy and legislation that could make a difference here have to do, first of all, co-signing Teresa's just raise people's income and the amount of money that is in their bank accounts. We can do that with a universal basic income. We could also do that by raising the minimum wage. We could do it for a huge sector of women workers in the restaurant industry by getting rid of the tipped minimum wage and just having restaurant workers have access to the overall minimum wage. Tipping, as some of us may know, is a vestige of slavery. It comes out of the Reconstruction period when enslaved people were newly liberated and would have to get paid for their labor. And the Southern ruling class wanted, in exchange for that payment, ongoing, ongoing diminishment of of Black people's autonomy and ways of being. So having a single minimum wage that is high, $15 an hour, sounds like the basic place to start on a minimum wage, but getting rid of exemptions like tipping, so that we have a fairer wage system in the country that helps everybody, those are good. The other set of policy issues, though, that strike me have to do with zoning, with local carve outs of neighborhoods, public transportation, business licenses, those kinds of things that contribute to food deserts in poor communities, and especially communities of color that are poor. And I think about, if you had more access to public transit, you could get around to collect food from the cheapest sources, from the most affordable sources, for example. But public transit policy is often set by the needs of transit elites, owners of auto companies and builders of highways, and not so often set based on the needs of people in a city who actually have to get around, a city or town who actually have to get around. I think about the kinds of zoning that leads in certain communities to having a liquor store on practically every corner, but very limited grocery options in those same places. Efforts to easily to help liquor store owners convert their businesses into something else that is helping to meet the needs of the community, particularly the food needs. And the last thing I think about is policies that make it easier to form and sustain food co-ops, cooperatives, cooperative grocery stores. In Brooklyn, the Park Slope Co-op, that's it, right? The Park Slope Co-op is like the most famous co-op in the country. It is huge, it is solvent, and it has a huge amount of participation from its volunteer members. But that co-op took a long time to build, and co-ops in general take a lot of time to build. There's very little public support for that kind of institution that could, in the end, though, make a huge difference to how people get their food.
Well, I want to start with repealing the Hyde Amendment, because this is an amendment that has been in place for, at this point, more than 40 years, that prevents the federal government from using federal programs to support abortion, access to abortion, healthcare. And so much of how abortion has been framed over the past several decades has been from an anti-abortion standpoint, where they frame it as irresponsible women. You should have just kept your legs closed. It's an economic issue, and so much of poverty, food insecurity, dependence on low wage and tip jobs really comes from this inability for women who rely on federal programs to chart their own reproductive course. I mean, we know that a majority of women who seek abortions are already mothers. It's not that, they're anti-child or they just, want to be sleeping around. It's that, it is a huge expense. And for women who are, invariably the ones doing the bulk of parenting, um, if they have to choose between, keeping the lights on and buying enough food for their family for a week, that's not a choice at all. I mean, that's just, basically so much. There's just a snowball effect from, the lack of reproductive choice. It becomes uh, less and less tenable for women who are unable to make their own reproductive decisions to actually find any sort of economic foothold. So, yeah.
I was eager to address this next question with you all, just because we are, hurtling towards the year anniversary of this pandemic, if you can believe that. At the top of the pandemic, and I do address this to some degree in my book, I remember seeing these, calls on social media from, everyone from like influencers to just like, really, high profile people in media to like broadly like activists, these calls to, stay home and wash your hands. And I remember those working interchangeably. Twitter, Instagram, all sorts of different messages basically saying that. And yet, to me, sitting on the other side of the screen and also like charting, how some feminist discourse has been, co-opted to serve oppressive bodies that keep women marginalized and underpaid and abused. I remember looking at these call outs on social media and thinking, but, like, it doesn't mean anything to say wash your hands if you don't have access to clean water, as all the families in Flint have been saying for years, as well as many indigenous communities in the United States. And the same for these calls to stay home assume that one, you have one, and that it's safe to be in the first place. And actually really early on in the pandemic, the UN basically called on various countries to say, when you do encourage your citizens respectively to stay home, please factor in some kind of plan for domestic abuse survivors, because their homes are not safe. Our country definitely did not do that, as did many others. But in speaking with you all and thinking about tonight, I'm interested in what you all think could have been a very proactive measure for exactly those communities, people who did not have a safe home to be in at the top of the pandemic and who did not have access to clean water. What do you think, Trump aside, let's just suspend that narrative, but what proactive measures federally or even on a state level do you think could have been done? And I actually want to go to Rinku with that first question.
Thank you. I don't know if I'll provide a satisfying answer or not, but I'm happy to talk about where I saw signs of hope at the top of the pandemic. So one thing we didn't mention is that I'm, as a volunteer, also the co-president of the Women's March Board of Directors. And the great thing about being Women's March and having the bulk of our sustaining funding coming from small donors, thousands of them all over the country, is that we could pivot very quickly from what we'd been doing before March 1st to what the country needed after March 1st. And although there are definitely structural things that could have happened that didn't in that period, for example, the nation could have for all of the people that it deemed essential workers, it could have provided actual additional resources to those workers to be able to work. So childcare, income, making sure their housing was okay, and helping to move them if it wasn't. All of those things would have enabled lots of essential workers and groups of essential workers to survive the pandemic, rather than, in fact, dying in droves and in very disproportionate numbers by race and class. Um, since we didn't have that, we had to do some of it ourselves. So the rise of mutual aid, I think maybe one of the silver linings of the pandemic, at least in the community and labor organizing world that I come from, is that mutual aid had always been a part historically of how our communities did things. And it was very closely tied to our efforts to change policy. So until policy changed, we had to take care of each other. And we did it we did it, and we connected that community building to the things that we had to fight for. Hull House and the whole settlement house movement comes out of that base. The United Farm Workers started with mutual aid projects, as well as contract fights with growers. So it's a part of pretty much every community that has ever fought for anything in this country has had mutual aid as a part of their program over time. And Women's March did the same. So when we pivoted, some of our early work was to make masks and personal protective equipment and get it out to folks. Some of our structural activity had to do with pushing the first stimulus through Congress and advocating for it. So I think that part of what worked, where it worked, was groups that were ready to communicate about their constituencies and what they were experiencing. I think farm worker organizations did a really great job of this. And in fact, people started paying attention to farm workers in a way that they really hadn't when they didn't have to think so hard about how is this food getting to my table. So I don't, in the absence of like deep structural power at the point that the pandemic started, the kind of power we would have needed to get Medicare for all instituted right away, for example, in the absence of that, we had to take care of ourselves and each other and fight for the short-term things that we could actually win. And I put the first stimulus in that category.
Andi, I'd like to go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I have been beating this drum for a while, but paying people to stay home, paying essential workers in particular to stay home. I mean, I feel like all the things I'm going to say really sort of turn on the assumption that the US government actually gives a shit, which I don't think we can make that assumption. Um, but yeah, I mean, without the social safety net that a lot of other countries have, there was just no choice. It was, go to work or don't make any money. And I feel like that's a very irresponsible way to run a government. And I think the other thing is uh, there was not a there was not a sense of morale. There was not a sense of we are in this together. Obviously, you know, it could have been different with a different leader. But the way that countries have pulled together, during wartime, during other crises, has so much to do with focusing on the possibilities of the collective and refusing to sort of go along as we've been going along, which is very much uh, prioritizing the individual, prioritizing the idea of choice, prioritizing the idea that, you know, any limits on your mobility, or, on your face, with mask is like trampling on your essential rights. So yeah, I mean, that is absolutely a major structural, shift. But I do think that stronger leadership could have helped people get in that mindset of we are all working to get this over with as soon as possible. Um, yeah, but and I agree. I agree with with Rinku that organizations and services that were already that already had things in place. For instance, organizations that work with unhoused people, food banks, et cetera, were able to be more nimble than a lot of other sort of service organizations. Uh, but again, I think in terms of having more overall support for those organizations, and making sure that they are not, just depending on donations from local folks. I think what we've learned, hopefully, from this pandemic is that, we can't sit around twiddling our thumbs when we know something bad is coming. And, increasingly, we know that there's going to be, for instance, like catastrophic weather events every year, catastrophic fire events on the West Coast. We act just completely shocked when these things continue to happen year after year because we have this sort of individualist mindset that makes us prone to magical thinking. Like, oh, it happened there last year. It can't happen to my town. Or, this mostly happens to these people. It doesn't happen to me. So it's not even structural. I mean, it's really just like changing the way we think about how we live in the world and our responsibilities to one another. And, not to be a huge pessimist, but I often worry that we are just too far gone as a society. We care too much about ourselves, and really reject as weak the idea that it's important to be able to depend on others.
I wanted to add quickly to Andi's point before I put the same question to Teresa. I think the fact that, Andi, that you raise like parallels, with other times of crisis in this country and wartime, I've been thinking about that a lot, with a lot of, how the most horrendous news stories throughout the pandemic are usually about weddings. Has anyone else noticed this? Like these super spreader events, like if it's not a gender reveal party, it's somebody's like 300-person wedding. And my grandmother's not alive anymore, but when she was, I was very close to her. And I remember being a little girl and finding her wedding photo, in a very like romantic way, as her granddaughter. And I remember remarking to her that, it was quite small. It was like just my grandparents and maybe like 4 other people. And when I asked her about it, she looked at me very sternly and was like, well, we got married during wartime. It was considered very gauche and inappropriate and disrespectful to have a big lavish wedding while everyone's, fathers, sons, brothers were serving overseas. And so that's why our wedding looked like that. And that was like, not a point of pride, I would say, but to her, like speaking to Andi's observation about this very collective investment in everybody being respected, everybody feeling okay, everybody feeling like their neighbors and, other people's families were respecting and acknowledging this huge thing that was happening in our country. And I feel like every time, I see these pieces about these like lavish super spreader wedding events that people are still having, I do think of her and I think of that wedding photo and I think of, how much has culturally changed for us to get there. Teresa, I want to put that same question earlier to you about like what, legislatively or even on a grassroots level, do you think could have been done at the top of the pandemic, specifically for, homeless, marginalized genders, or, people who don't have access to clean water, among other things?
Yeah, no, thank you. First off, I just want to acknowledge, I think there are something like 37 communities in the United States that do not have access to clean water on a daily basis. So the idea that it's like this abstract thing that only happened in Texas for, during the storm, or only happens, it's happening in communities all across the country. I would say a couple of things that I want to lift up. One is around who was able to pivot and provide support in communities. And I will take my hat off to what philanthropy was able to do, which was they pivoted really quickly and said to many organizations that they were funding, use dollars the way you need to service your community. Not all of us did it, but there were a number of philanthropies throughout the United States that were funding on the ground that said, here's what you need to do. And obviously we understand the government's not going to hold its role as supporting and providing basic needs to community members and placing strong values where they need to be placed. So I just want to lift that up because I think there's a lot of folks who don't understand how fast that happened. I think we could have seen we saw the hospitality services pivot really poorly, and we could have opened up more places and spaces so that when hotlines were getting calls about safety issues within homes, and teachers knew that they had students that weren't going to be coming out of their homes for safe spaces, we could have created a reporting system and reporting structure that could have helped transition some of those living situations in a way that would have allowed us to use hotels and other services in a way that makes more sense than just worrying about the bottom line. And I think that's really critically important to the conversation. I will say I'm a little bit of, the whole pandemic was handled poorly. So I see there's actually nothing hugely positive that I see on the policy side, because we saw an overall breakdown across the country about what that could look like. And in many, many, many states, we saw what that could look like. I don't think we're too far gone. So I'll push back against Andi. But I do think that it has created an opportunity for us to have real conversations. We saw and started a conversation about who are frontline workers. What role do they play? Why are they frontline workers? So yes, we had bus drivers, and we had, we had cashiers, and we had delivery truck. Every one of us in big cities relied on delivery trucks to deliver to us food, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think like there was a broader conversation about who are frontline workers, how much are they getting paid, what risks are they making and taking in order to do that. For those frontline workers who were part of governmental structures, we actually need to have a broader conversation about how and what we were doing to build, support, and sustain a middle class, which we really haven't had an economic conversation about that. And what we saw were most frontline workers, and many of those who were impacted, and I think Koa, you mentioned this even in your book, were obviously women, women of color, and low-income women who were unable to actually make it through these times with any kind of dignity. We took humanity out of the process and really pivoted into this, oh, what's going on in the world? How come these people can't put it together? This is going on now a year. So even if you had your 3 months of security in the bank, which most families did not have and do not have in this country, you already used it up, right? And then all of the government supports that were put in place, whether it was PPP or any kinds of other assistance that went into place, only affected those with incomes. You could tap into your retirement if you had a retirement. If you don't have a retirement, you couldn't tap into retirement to pay for the bills. We did not institute, carte blanche rental stalls so that everybody didn't have to pay their rent, so that we had people trying to decide what to do in those circumstances. And so I feel like the breakdown was on the policy side. There were not going to be policies, but people did come up with solutions. People did figure out what to do. And this will have a long-lasting legacy of folks who were not safe in their homes, had no place to go, and we provided no strong alternatives for them. And we also didn't address issues around housing for many immigrant communities and immigrant families who were living with multiple people in their homes, sharing, the cost of housing in New York, the cost of housing in many places. There's not enough affordable housing, and so you have multiple people living in one setting and not having any place to go. We had a grantee partner who literally called us and said, "Can we now use our dollars to help people find housing? Because our community needs to have access to getting out of their homes or out of their living situations, because the person who they share, it's a 2-bedroom apartment, they share their apartment with, isn't leaving, can't leave, and has COVID, right?" And so what does that look like? And I think the other thing I would just put on the table was we worried about economic stability, and we're seeing this now in these new conversations, without really having a conversation around how our capitalist structure really broke down in this moment. I mean, we're seeing, interestingly enough, we're seeing Wall Street and the markets do really well, and yet people have less money than they've ever had in their pockets and less money to spend, and are making really critical decisions about what that looks like. And I think we're going to see greater impacts on health, not just because of COVID, but because of stress on bodies and what that looks like ultimately.
Speaking of stress on bodies, I would now like to pivot to the childcare portion of the discussion. And I do have some questions that are, pertinent to the pandemic, but, in a lot of the sort of cultural examination that in some ways appears to be happening around like women and domestic labor, especially in COVID, I think it's really pertinent to look at pre-COVID data in terms of tracing, how we got here and how, especially if we're talking like middle-class women, how they ended up in this position of, not only being responsible for all the domestic labor in their home, but now also, effectively homeschooling their own children, and then whatever labor they have to do, outside the home. And that is a structural failure. I cite and analyze some data in my book that demonstrates that nationally, women of color have a harder time finding childcare in this country than white women. And often the two factors that make that a significant challenge for them is both cost and location. Latina and Native women are twice as likely as white women to not find childcare when in need. And then, furthermore, on top of that, Latinx families in particular are more likely than white and Black families to live in quote unquote childcare deserts. And then on top of that, there's also just the absurd cost of childcare in this country. I mean, I have a lot of data on that in my book that I encourage everyone to read, but we could spend a lot of time just doing the calculator on like the costs of childcare versus, college education. It's really monumental. When all of you hear data like that, and specifically, how childcare is not great or anywhere close to being fine in this country and has not been, really kind of for a while. There was some subsidized childcare in the 40s, actually during one of the world wars. But once, the women were yanked out of the war effort, all those facilities quickly shut down because it was decided that they were not important anymore. But when you see and hear data like that about women of color specifically not being able to find childcare because of cost and location, I mean, what does that convey to you about, women of color seeking a basic standard of living in this country? And I want to go to Teresa first with that question.
I'm only kind of like, the idea that we do not have universal childcare in this country is horrific. The cost of childcare in this country is horrific. And I actually want to lift up, there is a cultural relationship that needs to take place between childcare services. We assume that having a childcare center on a corner where somebody can drop off their child is what we want for childcare. And there are some real cultural realities and dynamics around childcare being provided, whether that's somebody who speaks the language that you speak in your home, serves the food that you serve, or open the hours. Childcare cannot be a, 8 to 6 o'clock kind of thing and still service communities, particularly Black and Brown communities who are working outside of that realm. And, so I think, we are the only now developed country that does not have any kind of childcare subsidy, assistance, et cetera, at all. And we see even during this pandemic time, what a toll that is having on so many families, particularly women, particularly Black and Brown women in this country who are trying to juggle all that they are trying to juggle right now. And it's not just childcare, it's all caregiving responsibilities. And that assumption that childcare, it's just about childcare is, needs to extend out the conversation. And so until we recognize that you mentioned this, Koa, actually in your book, right? This is not just about how you take care of your children. It's how do we care for our children and care for each other as a community? What does that look like? How do we, as we, also spread apart and live off of the internet, et cetera, how are we able to really build relationships and build trusting relationships? When you don't know your neighbors or you don't trust your neighbors, you don't know the community that you're in, that there's not a lot of flexibility. I mean, all of those things, and the cost of childcare. And we actually say to childcare providers and caretakers, whatever kind of caretaking that they are doing, they are the least paid in this country. And so, we are not even placing a value on those that are providing the service for us to get the other services that we need to have. There are, so many studies out there right now about caregiving, childcare, and the costs that it is having on our society. That I think it's really critical. This is not about whether you can have a nanny in your home or not. This is really about how do we provide safe spaces for children and safe spaces for parents and other caregivers who are looking to be able to build and support healthy children, healthy society, strong communities, and what that needs to look like ultimately. And we absolutely have to figure out a policy initiative that allows for that to happen on every single level, from all the healthcare services to childcare services and educational services at the end of the day.
Rinku, I'd like to go to you next.
Sure, thank you. The thought I'm having right now, there are a couple. One is that childcare is expensive because it's very labor intensive. You have to have a person with your child or with every 4 or 5 children. And so I worry a lot that when we talk about the price of childcare, that winds up actually devaluing the work of childcare. So I feel like we need to think hard about our rhetoric and the way we communicate about childcare, because if we if the frame is it's too expensive and families can't afford it, then there's to me, that has a negative effect on the people who are still deeply underpaid, who are trying to provide the childcare. And childcare should be a public concern. It should not be a private concern. And one of the greatest contributions of feminist thought and philosophy is to turn our private concerns, previously considered private concerns, into public concerns, and childcare is definitely one of those. But what prevents the smooth um, embrace of certain issues as public concern is racism. We should have a robust federal government, and we should have robust state governments, and their job should be to serve the people, to cover things that individuals would not be able to cover by themselves, mostly healthcare, childcare, things that should not be subject to a profit motive, like basic human survival and thriving things shouldn't be subject to profit, and yet they are in our country to an extent that is not true of any other developed country in the world. But what is true for us is that we're a multiracial society trying to build a government that's for everybody. And in the course of that, it's very easy to split Americans off from the desire for a strong government by implying that somebody undeserving will get those benefits just like you will, and that undeserving person doesn't have white skin usually, or if they have white skin, they're poor, or they're single parents. You know, they're not in a traditional heterosexual nuclear family. So in a lot of these policy debates, we're actually just relitigating Reconstruction again and again and again, the period right after the Civil War when reparations needed to be made and got made to slave owners rather than enslaved people. And the American instinct to prevent undeserving people from getting something that I deserve, but you don't. That's the individualism kicking in. That's a really important dynamic for feminists to understand, because the things that women need to be free of patriarchy, to have autonomy over our own bodies, are so often blocked from implementation by the idea that people of color are going to get them too, and we can't have that because they're a whole bunch of cheats. So a great kind of rhetorical and narrative assignment, I would say, to feminists of all colors in this country is to insert race into that public-private conversation and learn how to address it in useful ways that can interrupt the naturalness of it, the naturalness of the idea that it's really women who are supposed to take care of the kids and the kids in their own family. And if they're doing something other than taking care of the kids, they shouldn't be. They should be taking care of the kids. That idea has the weight of nature on it, even though it's completely man-made, literally man-made, and can be undone by human decision making. There's nothing biological about that. We can change it, but we're not going to be able to change it in this country if we can't deal with the racial dimensions of those debates.
I remember last summer, as the pandemic was really raging on, especially internationally, I read this basically like COVID update piece about Italy, you know, because they were one of the European nations that was hit first. And they had this amazing quote, translated, I assume, from this Italian mother of several young children, basically saying that it was outrageous that she was doing all of this work for free. And it was a very, it was a very earnest statement to read, you know, in the pandemic, but especially I think given the backdrop of her nation and, you know, what she has been raised to have, especially for her kids, you know, in terms of, you know, certain childcare options and stuff like that. And, you know, in a lot of ways, when I read her circumstances, she seemed like a lower middle class, like American mother, like standard living. But for this woman in Italy, this was a crisis. Whereas in America, that's how many women parent, frankly. Andi, I want to put the question to you last.
Yeah, so while Rinku was talking, I started thinking about something that will always make me mad, even though I was not around when it happened, which is that in 1971, there was a bipartisan bill that was a comprehensive childcare bill. And it passed both houses of Congress, and it ended up in front of Richard Nixon, who just straight up vetoed it because he said that it encouraged a socialist approach to child rearing that was against, American values. And I think it's important to acknowledge the dog whistle in that, which is, like Rinku said, we can't all be equal, because then we will have to acknowledge that whiteness is not at the center of what we value about Americanness. And, that's just too much of a heavy lift. And I still think that's the case. And, anytime we're talking about, work-life balance or childcare, the media takes on it generally do focus on the lives of white women. And a lot of it has to do with the idea that um, there's this real conservative anxiety that women, if they get too successful, if they get too into their careers, are going to stop producing white babies. And we can't have that. It's not a rational necessarily thought, but like racism isn't rational. It's very emotional, and it's more specifically, it's based in the emotion of fear. So I definitely think that that central uh, racism, that central ideal of American whiteness as the only thing that is deserving of, our our federal government support has been damaging, obviously, for far longer than 2020 and the pandemic. But I think the other thing that it's very something that I think feminism has done a very like a really lousy job of doing is pointing out that parenting should be a shared burden. And in heterosexual couples, I have seen entire articles sort of hand wringing about work-life balance for, white women that literally never mention their partners. Like it's this idea that uh, it's not because women, are expected to shoulder the burden of childcare, that it's a women's issue and it's not a larger economic issue. And indeed, a lot of these articles are often found in, like the New York Times style section or women's magazines, because it really is considered, um, you know, a women's issue. And, you know, again, feminism has been so white feminism, I should say, has been so obsessed with not alienating white men that there's this real reluctance to identify, you know, white heterosexual men with partners, um, you know, as a problem, the expectation that they will always have wives, the expectation that their work is more important, and that if they're the if they make a couple dozen thousand more dollars than their wives, then their career should be the one that takes precedence. um, I think that feminism has to really reckon with that inability to identify white heterosexual men as a problem. It's very hard because every time, like, even when I've written about this in the past, you get women writing back and being like, well, not my Nigel, not my husband's wonderful. And, this idea that individual exceptions are somehow, amount to the actual state of things economically, um, is something that feminists have let slide, because we have this idea that if we're just nice enough to men, eventually they'll get on board with equality and feminism. And we have no reason to think that. But I think that's the basis for so much of conversation about childcare policy, leave policy, any sort of government policy that assists with childcare. And yeah.
I just want to jump in because I think, one of the things Andi was alluding to was we are in a patriarchal, sexist, misogynist centric society, and the decision makers are those who are sitting in Washington, D.C. and in state houses. And they are living in levels of elitism that they're like not even recognizing. And they also are not in any way, shape, or form acknowledging the complexities of the lives of the citizens that they are supposed to be representing. And as long as this country assumes that a capitalist patriarchy is what we're supposed to be sitting in, and that's white supremacy is what we're supposed to be functioning around, we're going to end up having these conversations around childcare. I mean, in all reality, this has always been the conversation. It has been women of color who have been caring for the master's child and then going home and having to care for their own children. And it didn't stop the master from deciding what they were going to do or not do when it came to, violently abusing and being sexual predators to them and their children and their family members. And I just feel like, what Andi, I think, was aiming for was this: there's a reality that a patriarchy will never put in place the central part of a reality around what feminism should be, which I believe is the social, political, and economic equality of all genders, which means that in order to get to gender equity, we all have to be in the conversation. Childcare is one aspect of it, healthcare is another, environmental justice is another. I mean, there are so many realities to it. And until we can come up with an alternative structure for the policies that need to be introduced and how they get passed in this country, we're going to still bump our heads against the lack of policy supports that will actually get us to greater levels of equity and inclusion and equality for anybody, let alone women of color, gender non-conforming, binary, non-binary folks, trans folks. All of those will still be left off the table, whether it's childcare or any other issue.
I wanted to close with basically an answer that Andi gave already, which I think is really telling just now. Before we get to questions, because there are so many and I've been checking up on them and they're very good. So if you want to ask a question, now is your sort of last window. When we did part one of this discussion, which went into more dynamics of white feminism, Roxane Gay said that, a lot of the issues that we have spoken about tonight, in conversation one-to-one, they can fall along the lines of what Andi just alluded to, of like, well, my male partner is great. My husband watches the kids all the time. My husband supports my career, so I'm able to do all these things. And I think I said something to the effect of like, your husband is not a structural solution, hands down. And I feel like white feminism in particular has really latched on to that narrative as like really centralizing debates about domestic labor, and that like what you need is like a cis partner who like changes diapers with you, and like that's what you need. You don't need, you know, any of the structural things that we've been talking about tonight. But, you know, when you hear things like that in terms of like what Andi just raised, what Roxanne just raised, about, you know, finding this partner who will then like absolve all of these structural barriers to housing or clean water or, you know, affordable childcare, as we've spoken about tonight. How does that invisibilize structures? And Andi, again, I feel like you answered this already, but if you want to say anything else, I leave the floor open to you. But Rinku, I want to go to you first with that question.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I know a lot of men who do significant amounts of childcare and cooking and cleaning. And even if they were joined by lots more men like them, it wouldn't be enough, because there are a lot of people in this country, and in the world. And if we have to go one by one, convincing, you know, someone in a family to change their behavior, it's going to take forever, and there will be too much loss along the way. So I think really, though, you need, as a society and as people making change, we need multiple strategies. We need a policy strategy that will change systems. We need a narrative strategy. Now I'm like right in my new role as director of narrative initiative. We need a narrative strategy that challenges the big ideas. And I actually think on this one, the big idea isn't, do men own women? You know, do women work for men? The big idea is individualism, that we're all supposed to handle this shit on our own, excuse me. And if we can't, then, you know, too bad, so sad. But nobody's going to come and help you do anything. We have in actual community, we have tons of experience that runs opposite of that where people are building their lives on the knowledge that I can't do this by myself, and it takes a village. It takes a village idea, but we need political, cultural, journalistic, philanthropic strategies that create the kinds of situations that make it so a woman doesn't have to think about, if I want a good life, I have to find a male, a cis male partner who will do this and this and this and this. Like, that's not something I can build my life around, for example, certainly not at this age. But there was a time that, even as an organizer and a feminist and a racial justice person, I found it so easy to fall into that view of my life and of what it was supposed to be. And I found it much harder to think about, the core of my life is getting with other people to make our government responsive, to build it to be what we need it to be. And so as much as we can do in our own context to build for community, rather than, and to disrupt the idea of the individual being the first and last unit of everything, then we might be able to make some progress, with the caveat of that has to be deeply racialized in order for us to deal with our own history. And I guess the only other thing I want to just say, actually, we're going to go to questions, so I'm going to stop talking now and let the next person get it.
Teresa, how do you respond to that?
I actually would love to go to the questions. I actually think what Rinku has said and what Andi said is right, which is, until we decide that we want to come together as a community and build as a community, there will be huge gaps. And we actually have to also create enough space that we can test things and and those tests can fail and succeed and learn from each other, as opposed to the idea that I'm going to do it one way, that's the only way it can get done, and that's the only thing. We need to really create a level of spaciousness for what communities should look like, how they could look, how they can formulate practices, and then how government can play a significant role in ensuring that we have really strong communities across the board.
Great. So with that, I'm going to go to questions, and they're really great, not surprising. The first question I'm going to take is from Shelley Rose, and she says, how can white feminists be active allies in BIWOC-centered feminism? I feel like I can speak to that because that's kind of what my book's about, honestly. But I want to say this with a very strict understanding of, what you're saying when you say white feminists. I mean it, with regard to the definition I said at the top of the talk, and not necessarily white women broadly. I've had to make that distinction throughout book tour and for, a lot of promotional materials. But I think that, broadly speaking, what I've seen, especially reviewing all the historical research that I did for this book and seeing how, movements led by working class women, led by queer people, led by Native movements, led by immigrant women, the thing that they have in common is really, what all of our panelists have said tonight, where they're not looking to ascend individually in a system that prioritizes very specific values, nor are they gauging their progress as a community on one woman in their neighborhood ascending to a certain class, one woman in their neighborhood ascending to a certain role, one woman in their community having, a very specific visibility. It's much more collective in terms of having access to, affordable meat, everyone having access to, a certain either income level or, housing situation. And I think if you're operating in your feminism from a white feminist understanding, the checkpoint is really to not come to your feminist consciousness from a place of what you need as an individual in terms of your own family, your own income, your own, life, a place where white feminist ideology differs from truly everybody else who has ever organized or thought about a lot of the structures we've spoken about tonight, is that they think collectively. So it's not just about them in their home with their partner and their children. They're thinking about the other woman and her children down the street. They're thinking about, what the women who also have kids who go to the same school as their children need. They're also thinking about, other women in their family, as well as a lot of other women that they work with in any capacity. So that would be my advice. What would anyone else like to address this question?
I can take a stab. I think the thing I would want for white feminists to embrace, the idea that I'd want them to embrace, is the idea of multiracial organizing. I don't think it's a matter of women of color form their organizations and white women should be allies. If in fact we want the liberation of all women from patriarchy and other ills, then we have to organize for that together. And that's messy, it's hard, but if you can pull it off, it is actually rewarding. And it is the thing that gives me some hope that we might be able to actually shape public institutions and government in the ways that we need them to be. So I might say the first thing I would do is stop thinking in ally terms and look for a community or an organization to join that is multiracial, that is feminist, that has feminist goals, and probably other kinds of goals as well, and join it and just start working with us. Like, I don't need allies. I need some friends. with whom I can organize to win things that we all want. Maybe we don't want it in exactly the same form. Maybe I need my childcare subsidy in a different kind of form than someone who has more money than I do, or who has a male partner or who has younger kids. But if we both need publicly supported childcare, in racial justice, there's a concept called targeted universalism, which is the idea that you have universal goals. You want everybody to have good food, everybody to have good health care, everybody to be well housed, but that different communities need different things in order to get to that goal. That's the targeted part. So universal goals, targeted strategies. Multiracial feminist organizations can adopt a similar principle to figure out what their agenda is and what they're going to fight for together. That's what I'm aiming for and looking for.
Would anyone else like to address that? Shall I move on?
I'll say one thing, which, I think I'm not a huge fan of the idea of allies, because I think in practice, what it often is people who are certainly well-meaning, waiting to be told what they can do rather than just sort of taking the initiative and doing it. And I think, again, it's not that I don't think that comes from a good place, and I'm speaking to here white feminists and feminists of color. I do think it comes from a good place, but you know, the way that white women can help is not really by sort of hanging around the fringes of um, you know movements led by women of color, and sort of waiting to be given a job. It's really taking that to their own communities and raising their consciousness and talking about the differences in approaches, and talking about things like targeted universalism. um, I think at Bitch, we had this moment, probably 10 years ago, when we realized, like, we live in Portland, which is I think the whitest big city in the United States, and we are having, when we have open positions, the majority of applicants we get are white women. And I think we didn't want to talk about quotas, because we thought that was not, and it felt wrong to talk about quotas, because we didn't want it to feel like bean counting or tokenization. And at some point we were just like, well, that's actually that's white fragility talking, and we need to get over that, because studies have shown that, like, quotas work. You have to get real with yourself if you are going to be committed to building, in our case, a workplace that reflects you know the multifacetedness of feminism and the sort of intersecting concerns and realities. So, I think a lot of it is just sort of realizing, I think, in terms of getting back to the question of how best to be an ally, I think it's, figuring out what you can do, or what you could do, if you weren't worried about um, doing it wrong, I guess, for lack of a better word.
I'm going to go to our last question of the night, because it is good and I really want to give everybody the opportunity to respond to it. Amanda Stanton asks, as a woman who is a teacher, I would like to ask how you feel feminism, especially during the pandemic, has failed teachers. How can we begin to serve teachers in feminism and in real structural change? I want to add quickly, I think that is a very pertinent and very valuable question, especially being across all these national narratives that were going on about, white collar women specifically being so overwhelmed in the home, I'm always picking up on this like really, really dusted tonality about, how come the teachers can't just take them back to school, that doesn't underscore really the risk to teachers and the risks they would be taking on, as the people who would run these classrooms in person. And then just a lack of, again, we're coming back to individualism again, this lack of understanding of like the resources it takes to put your child into school safely with all these other children safely who are from different homes. And I think that in a lot of what I've been reading and following, seeing various teachers unions like really take a stand on this in terms of, mandating, depending on where you live in the country, that teachers do get vaccinated and that be prioritized above, just getting kids back into school and just like giving parents that relief. But I think that Amanda's question really gets to this, again, this like lack of understanding of the ways in which we are these communal resources to each other and need protections, much in the way that essential workers do. I'm going to leave this open to whoever would like to address Amanda's question.
I mean, I'm happy to say something quick about it to get us started. I mean, teaching is an extension of childcare in the minds of most Americans. And even if it's not that explicitly, it is that implicitly. So if you, they might say initially, oh, yeah, teaching is noble because it's preparing our kids to be in the world and do good things. But the pandemic has really showed how many households rely on schools as a form of childcare. And because we don't have any publicly subsidized childcare. So I think that teaching as a profession segregates women into it, and then those women by race once they're in the profession. And it suffers a lot, and a lot. It doesn't get the public support as a sector of workers that they deserve, because people think if you're responsible for caring for children, you should be doing that no matter what you're getting paid. And in fact, it's that there isn't a monetary value put on childcare, which is why when we do it at home, it's free labor. And when we do it for other people, it's low wage labor. So I think an important thing to do is whether whoever is taking care of kids, whether it's childcare providers or teachers or moms or elder sisters, that their work has to be clearly articulate. The value of their work has to be more clearly articulated than it is now. And if we want to change the mindset, we have to do more than throw data at people. We have to have an actual long-term narrative strategy to so that all the different stories of what teachers are providing and how they are treated end up adding up to a challenge to the big idea that women are responsible for kids and should take care of them no matter what else these women are doing, and no matter whether the kids are their own or not. That idea has to be disrupted. And as a movement of people who care about teachers and kids and childcare providers and moms, we need to get to work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that, well, I'm not sure really if it was feminism that failed teachers during the pandemic so much as the fact that, capitalism and our government and our economy, and once again, our, conception of, everyone out for themselves, failed teachers and the educational system, long before this. It's been doing this for decades. And again, this is one of those things that the pandemic made it starker than ever. But it existed before. And yeah, I mean, Rinku's so right. When we have this narrative about feminized professions, about the idea that women are sort of naturally suited to childcare, naturally suited to teaching, that that allows people to sort of let slide a lot of really important discussions that have to happen, not just about equity in education, but about why, how we educate, why we educate. Um, Brittany Cooper said something really interesting in the last panel, which was, that the culture of work has never been equitable. So that when we talk about, equity, we almost can't do it. And I think that is the thing when we look at workplaces and what they, do or don't do for women. What we're ignoring is the fact that, the capitalism doesn't actually care about our gender. It just wants us to be sort of productive automatons when it comes right down to it. Uh, these things remain feminized, but it really is about extracting as much labor from humans as possible without having to make any sort of special accommodations or really understand what the different needs are in different communities for different reasons. So that's, again, that is a huge overarching conversation / problem that needs to be addressed in so many ways. But I definitely think that it has informed the way that the discussion about education at teachers has been really flattened during the pandemic.
Teresa, last word.
Yeah, I think the reality is the pandemic showed the light on so many of the injustices, devaluation, and inequalities that we have in our society. And feminism was not going to put a stop to any of those things before the pandemic. What it would have done is changed a philosophy and an approach if we had not centered on white feminism, as you mentioned, but really centered on a communal approach to getting to a society that actually has us all at our very best and places value on everybody and ensures a level of safety, a level of health and happiness, a level of openness, a level of respect that actually gets put into the play. And so it is unfortunate, but it was bound to happen, and nobody should be surprised, and nothing that showed up during the pandemic should have surprised any of us. It just highlighted a broken down system. What it will take is not allies, but all of us sitting in uncomfortable places to make the world, to make this country, to make our communities what they need to be. And we have to be willing to be uncomfortable and take risk in order for that to happen. And we have to step out of the narrative that we can do it ourselves, because we cannot. And there are very few communities that can, and figure out how we're going to do it together, and how many doors we're going to open, and how many communities, how many people we're going to bring into the fold as that happens. And when I say get uncomfortable, it means don't rely on women of color to continue to save this country. Rely on us all being a part of what that needs to look like and how we can get there. And let us not forget that feminism is political, and we need to all participate in the process.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We're going to stop there. There are amazing questions in this Q&A. You can find all these illustrious thinkers on Twitter, and you can ask them what we did not address. But thank you so much for your participation. Thank you so much, Rinku, Teresa, Andi. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you also to the Center for Brooklyn History for furnishing this for us. Also, Ms. Foundation for Women. Also, all of my love to BPL. You were a very big part of my time in New York, and you facilitated a lot of the research for white feminism for my book. So thank you so much. And thank you also to Community Bookstore for furnishing my books for this event. Thank you very much. Everyone stay safe, good night, and I'll see you online.